Record if you're not comfortable, you're free to opt out uh, of the whole session. So I'll give a brief preamble, but more just to introduce the topic a bit, to frame it, because there's a technical version and then there's maybe more of a philosophical version, or at least the questions to consider can be philosophical. So I was just saying to Diane how the article I shared, it is rather technical, and it comes out of a thorough biological study of plant domestication over human history. And I shared that example and as sort of the best of in terms of the application of some of these broader theoretical concepts into a really interesting case of convergent evolution in multiple levels. Um, but as I was saying to Diane, I think the topic of convergent evolution, that idea, hasn't quite broken out of biology in the ways that other topics we've discussed have. And so that article is actually sort of representative, I think, of the literature on it. And that's not to say it hasn't been applied in other areas, such as culture and history and economics even, but in more loose ways. And I think in part that is because the concept of convergent evolution, this idea that under similar selection pressures, independent adaptive systems will develop kind of similar functional solutions to the point of convergence by some definition. Often, I mean, in its early days, convergence would be something you would just notice morphologically, just by the way things looked. But of course, now with genetics, we can get extremely granular with the sort of analogous structures that we're comparing. And so there are some kind of classic examples, just as simple as the evolution of wings in birds versus bats, completely different evolutionary lineages, or even the evolution of fruits in plants in order to attract said birds and bats. And then then it starts to get more complex once you leave the realm of genetics, because the ability to separate these adaptive processes becomes increasingly complex. In a biological system, you can actually identify the separation of populations. You can see that the degree to which there have been migrations between genetic pools. But in cultural systems or other kinds of adaptive inheritable systems of traits, the separability, a kind of mathematical or philosophical concept at heart, becomes increasingly fraught from an ontological perspective. It's akin to the separation of a mixture. Take two liquids and mix them together. Can we separate those? In chemistry, sure, at times, but for behavior and ideas, the whole notion of culture as a collaborative process, one that's being influenced across networks. And at the same time, there's another interesting philosophical point I would like to pose. In light of that seemingly more fraught separability of culture and behavior, is the fundamental independence of human minds. So despite the fact that what we think, what we do, our cultures, our norms, are being influenced by each other, for each of us to actually have the same idea that another has in our head, we must think it. And so there's all kinds of imitation that's happening, but I can't ever know what's in your head, and you can't actually put what's in your head in my head. The best you could do is speak or act or produce something that can help me approximate what's in your mind. But that's the key word, is approximation. So fundamentally, there's a convergence because each of our minds operates on its own independent kind of system, as close as they may be informed by the content. So those are kind of two different angles to take, I think, in terms of, and we can also discuss the article I shared as well. There's some interesting bits there in terms of how we have a convergence kind of a little bit of a cycle here where you have these multiple cultural patterns of agricultural origins, different societies. They may be more nomadic, maybe depending on their patterns, but they separately domesticate plants, which then creates this niche where they can be sedentary now. And they got to this sedentary kind of lifestyle, for lack of a better word, through independent means in terms of the specific plants and the things they were selecting for. But now that that's there, they've kind of reached the stable state of both domesticated plants and a sedentary lifestyle. And so that's maybe an easier example to think of because much of the convergence starts at the biological level, and then that influences behavior. So the idea of how humans approximate the same thing is actually coming from their relation to this shared niche of domesticated plants. So that might be separable. So with that, I will open it up to anybody who has some initial thoughts or ideas or whatever you have. So yes, Hank.
Yeah. Oh, hi, all. Just in the last piece of comment you made about mind, theory of mind, or I was just thinking about subjectivity, which is one of the last things you talked about, which I hadn't thought about, and how because we cannot, everybody's subjectivities is like its unique genetic structure that nobody else shares in some way. That divergence in subjectivity and the convergence that we all can think and we can think about similar things, but there's divergence there is just something I'm just thinking about now as a therapist now and see how I can make use of it, as well as hear from others about whatever else we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's
Well,
a
the other,
structure.
oh, sorry.
There's a
One more
structure of
thing.
this. Go ahead, Hank. Yes.
Yeah, sorry. What I did was some reading up about cultural, not just biological, but cultural and convergence and divergence. So I looked at some articles on that and sort of interesting way of looking at things that's probably familiar to most of us, but just to mention it.
Yes, there's just to your first point, there's a kind of a structuralist aspect of our evolved psychology. We all have the same fundamental structures and even processes by which those structures operate, but each one of us occupies a completely unique life history. And so the actual ways and our own kind of behavioral contingencies change over our life. So a way we might react to some situation in the morning is different than after lunch. So there's a level of, I'm asserting a level of fundamental independence that goes all the way down. So I want to get to Rob and Steve next, especially Steve, since he's going to have to leave early for us. But Rob, you go first.
I'm interested in the evolution of culture, and I think about Christopher Boehm's idea that several couple of 100,000 years of hunter-gatherer egalitarianism actually began to affect the genome, and we now have, in his opinion, I think, genes that tend to drive us towards moral behavior that we didn't have when we were hierarchical primates. Maybe Diane can help me out with this. And it seems to me that this is a convergent phenomenon, and that it's going both between culture, and I think the domestication of plants thing is similar. We domesticated the plants, but they domesticated us as well. So the flow of genes and memes back and forth is two directions. So that was my first thought.
Steve. Muted Steve.
A preliminary comment would be that I just would be cautious about not overestimating our uniqueness. But the question that I had is, when I read the article, it reminded me of a discussion in Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, about the beginnings of agriculture. And my recollection has been many years since I read that book, but that he raises the question of whether agriculture occurred in different regions because of cultural transmission, or whether it evolved independently in different geographical regions, albeit at different times. My recollection is that Diamond landed on the side of that it developed independently. And I'm wondering if somebody or someone on the Zoom here is sort of up to date on that anthropological question.
Well, I'll put my 2 cents in there, and I'm sure that it's a both end, but I do know that um, just given the differences of crops, at least, there's still a level of independent sort of innovation that needed to take place because you're selecting for completely different plants. So I'm sure that there's a mixture of stories depending on the anthropological record, and if others know that better, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, that would make sense that the plants that were domesticated differed, but the question is the concept of domestication,
Mhm.
regardless of what plants you were domesticating, was that by cultural spread, or did it arise convergently, independently in different places?
Mhm. Diane or Rob, did you have a quick response to that, Steve?
Well, very quickly, the domestication of wheat in the Near East happened, and a couple of thousand years ago, domestication of rice with wet rice farming in the Far East developed. And it's unclear whether there was an influence from wheat farming to rice farming, if there was even contact. But you think about corn in the New World, and it's a little hard to imagine that there was a direct influence on those cultures. So both and.
Mhm. Diane?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to say both and too, but just comment on Diamond. It seemed to me that he was concentrating more on the ease of, the spreading either through cultural means or through physical means, based on the geography of the different places. So that, his argument was that across Eurasia, there weren't a lot of barriers, whereas there were almost impassable barriers within North and South America, particularly South America. So that slowed things down because, the sort of premise of the whole book is, why was Europe so far ahead of every place else in terms of its technology? So he was trying to explain that. But then this article that we read, insofar as I understood it, I was telling Sage, it really was kind of over my head, but it sounded as if there were at least shreds of evidence of much earlier beginnings of domestication than anybody was aware of in Diamond's time. So, I mean, he wrote that book, what, 20 years ago or something, more than 20 years ago. And this sounded like it was pretty recent evidence about the, the gradual change of the morphology and other characteristics of plants, which couldn't have been available then. So maybe it was more parallel than we think. Who knows? Or more simultaneous.
Yes, Rob.
I think that we now know that there was evidence of horticulture, particularly caring for fruit trees, and changing the landscape by burning grasslands to replenish the soil before there was sedentism. So I sort of associate agriculture full blown with sedentism, with staying in one place. And that was a dramatic change in human society, human life. So it's interesting to figure out whether it was, happened one place and then spread, or whether it was spontaneously generated because of the change in climate with the Holocene.
I'm glad you can help us fill in the gaps of our specifics here, Rob. Thank you.
It's my last book, so.
We're
Ah,
lucky. Hank, did you want to jump in?
yeah, just talking about domestication reminded me of literature that I'm not really up to date on, but about human domestication. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with that literature, but I just have a beginning idea of it. But in the context of convergence and divergence, and how the hell did that all happen? And then I think, Steve, you said something, about the divergence of our minds, and we ought to be, are we that different, in our subjectivity? So these are just some thoughts that are coming up as we're talking. But if anybody is aware of the literature on the human domestication, if I can be reminded in a chat, I wouldn't mind. I don't know where to go right now.
Read
Well,
Richard Wrangham's new book, The Goodness Paradox,
Yeah.
is
Okay.
a great discussion of self-domestication. There's also an Old Examined Lines video online where we discussed that once in this group.
Yeah, so when keep an eye out for there's the YouTube playlist. I could share the link here. We
Oh,
did do
great.
that. We did do that a session on human self-domestication, and I'll recommend another book, Survival the Friendliest by
Yeah.
well, now I'm forgetting the exact.
Hare,
Yeah, Brian Hare,
Hare,
Vanessa
Brian Hare.
Hayes. So they're great. We did a webinar with them too, and they explore
Oh,
this topic of domestication deeply as kind of a thesis around uh, how humans have become the way we are, in part from various domestication processes, such as those we've discussed around agriculture. But they talk about dogs, and they actually talk about domestication as just a general concept. Um, there's the Siberian fox study, where they've been domesticating wild foxes for generations now, probably over 100 years, I think, probably at this point, or getting close, and they're this new kind of domesticated animal now. I think they must be at maybe like 20, maybe 30 generations. I'm just kind of trying to remember. It's been a while. But these foxes are like little fox dog hybrids. They're so friendly. They're like, you could have them as a pet, basically. They've managed to domesticate them. And at the same time, they've kept another group wild foxes that they haven't done any selection on for friendliness, and they're surprisingly much more fearful of humans and avoidant. And so domestication, I think, in a word, is a kind of what seems to be the through line around all different kinds of domestication for at least animals, is a preservation of certain kind of juvenile stages of development in terms of curiosity, sort of trustingness. There's even interesting things around short tails and snout and something like that. So whether it's a horse or a fox, these things sort of um, are part of this piece. So, Rob.
The foxes do have a tendency to pee in the laps of their owners. So they're not fully domesticated. You
Right.
can't house them.
Yeah. But it's a great empirical example of like, well, what is domestication, and how could it have really occurred for all these other creatures that the process is long lost to us in history? But this one, we see these parallels, and I think there's a definitely universal process. That being said, these are all kind of mammalian, I think, examples. So the patterns aren't uh, profound beyond that. Kathleen, did you want to ask that question over video, or I can read it out?
Well, I wrote, does the infantilization also include emotional dependency on the parent? Because this whole idea that subjectivity is absolutely unique, I don't think is really true. You know, I've done a certain amount of studying in interpersonal neurobiology, and there are underlying brain functions related, connected to attachment.
Mhm.
And there is a similar process in all human beings across around basic attachment and identity forming to be human. So I do think that that is a through line in terms of what we're calling domestication culturally and, you know, individually.
Yes, and that's a huge part is when you have these altricial species that are totally dependent on their parents or others to take care of them. So this prolonging of that period is a huge way that humans then bond with these animals, and then it actually is. I think that part of it is that it ever doesn't really ever turn off. There isn't that then kind of, okay, here's my inner circle and the rest is sort of a threat potentially. There's a sort of generalized trust that is kind of just maintained, at least in terms of these animal stories. And I think that dependency, especially when you think about more and more social animals and all the way up to humans, then that's a really interesting bit about in terms of what this kind of process would look like in a human life story, basically. Hank?
Yeah, I was taking it down to the personal level, and as a therapist, I was thinking about, well, if we looked at our own domestication, let's say mine and my family and their particular tribe and their particular uh, uh, social group and their cultural group and their religious group and their ethnic group and their geography. I don't know, people who come from my line. I wonder how our subjectivity is similar or different. So it's just on a personal level. I forgot about how my parents tried to domesticate me, and it didn't really work that well according to their rules. But I found other ways to domesticate myself in a way that I can operate with the illusion of my independence. So
I think that probably goes for all of us in some ways.
yeah.
Steve?
Well, I wanted to bring us back to the topic of convergent evolution. And a question I have really is, are there controversies about that I'm unaware of? Because when I read the article and I Googled a little bit, the definition of convergent evolution that I came across was simply when species occupy similar ecological niches, they adapt in similar ways because they're responding to similar selective pressures. And I thought,
Mhm.
okay, that seems like a no-brainer. So in terms of human evolution, are there controversies here that I'm unaware of? I just don't know enough about this topic to know that.
Well, I'll just say I think that the biological literature around it is going to be more clear cut because of that issue of separability, and then I think that any of the fuzziness or potential controversy is going to come down to the extent to which we can actually reckon with the potential inseparability of other kinds of adaptive processes that aren't genetic based, strictly. And I think that's a question we could ask right now in terms of, do we think that, just to make it cute, we have genes and memes, right? Do we think that we can, that our, the question of separability when it comes to memes is actually just a question of methodology and the sophistication of our ability to distinguish different kinds of um, transmission at that level and the kind of context in which they occur and are being selected for? Or is there actually something more fundamental in that these really aren't inseparable? Um, and I think you could, and when you think about even the concept of language as a shared resource, shared trait fundamentally, each one of us hasn't come up with the language we use. it gets harder to say that, you know, anything we think is sort of somehow separable from the thoughts of others, because our even capacity to have a thought depends on that thought being possible. And so, but yeah, we're kind of, that's straying into the edges here of what we mean. And I don't know any good controversies offhand, actually, but
Hmm.
I think that question will be at the heart of them.
Controversy.
Got one, Rob? Kathleen, Hart?
Hi, I'm sorry I was late. Since I missed everything, and I hope this isn't too off topic, but in literary studies, and I honestly can't even remember if this was my idea or maybe Brian Boyd's, sorry about that, but we find in many parts of the world the same story, like the Emperor's New Clothes. There's a version of that, and it would appear to have arisen without any interaction between the two cultures from which it arose. And so this is just, to me, an interesting idea of convergence, or a possible way of understanding it in terms of the kind of stories we come up with. In other words, something similar is happening, and it's not as if one story evolved from the version of another story. So I just was putting that out there as a kind of interesting parallel, you know, between the flying squirrel and the North American squirrel not being related in a very close way, but just certain conditions produce a very similar form and set of traits.
Yeah, it's quite profound to think of what those certain conditions would be that would result in a similar story that has the same meaning. But I think that's the key, is that it's kind of like you can see that the flying squirrel is not related to the North American squirrel genetically. And they have a convergence in the phenotype. You can't really see whether the ideas are sort of like scaffolding conditions of thoughts or culture are separated, and then at the point at which the story might be independently produced, you know, you have to kind of take in consideration now the whole suite of things that what that conditions is. And so I mean, not to say there haven't been isolated human populations throughout history, so I think there are examples, but we have to kind of do our homework, I think, to really ensure it. And that's the question: if they're not truly separated, if that's probably the default case, then convergence just becomes a sticky issue, I think, and we'll have to see. Yeah. You want to jump in, Simon? Yeah.
Well, I mean, coming back to the story, the convergent stories that Kathleen mentioned, I mean, I got into a discussion on Twitter, actually, about the flood stories, which are widespread. And I suggested, well, what's causing that? And somebody replied to me, well, actually, it's just the flooding of rivers locally. That happens all over the world. And you could argue about the Emperor's New Clothes, that hierarchical societies existed pretty much everywhere across the world, and therefore there was a strong incentive to, behind the back of the emperor, do him down, if you like, or her down. So you can see similar social situations and actually also environmental situations occurring worldwide, which might generate these similar stories.
Hank?
Yeah, I was wondering about, let me get my thoughts straight, about tribalism. And is that a divergent phenomenon, or to accentuate the differences for whatever, but this is on an evolutionary basis we're talking. And I mean, on a humanistic or social psychological level. Well, I was thinking of, maybe people know this guy's name, but he was he talked about he disagreed with Freud about some things, but the one that he said is basic is that humans are afraid that we'll all be too much alike, or that I don't know what he called it, but the terror of that we'll all mimic each other to death. I mean, I'm just using my simplistic metaphor, and I can't remember who it is now. And that we need to create vast differences because of this vetted terror of that we're all going to mimic each other and look like our dogs or something like that. So is anybody familiar with that thinking? It just came back to me after about 10 years of not seeing that. But is that divergent? Is it human made as well as genetic? Cultural evolution. That's another thought around these things. And these narratives about divergence, like Russia and Ukraine or anybody. Yeah.
Thanks, Hank. Steve?
Oh, Hank's comment made me think of the wonderful scene in The Life of Brian when I think it's the character portraying Jesus says to the crowd, "But you're all individuals and you need to think for yourselves." And they all chant in unison, "Yes, we're all individuals and we'll all think for ourselves." I was going to comment on Kathleen's comment and then Simon's follow-up. I think that's really there's really useful, Kathleen, to talk about that. And what Simon added to it was that certain social pressures really in human interaction might have produced these similar stories. What I was just going to add as a sort of a postscript to that is that I believe there's quite a lot of similarities in both stories and ethics across world religions. I believe I've read that widely separated religions, for example, have some version of the virgin birth. Now why would that be? Well, there'd be, we won't go down that path, but there probably are ways to think about that in terms of the selection pressures of us as social primates that might have led to those kinds of stories. So I just thought that was religion is another good example, I think, and ethics too. The ethics of religions. Every religion has some version of the golden rule, phrased differently in different religions, but nearly all religions have some version of that. And that makes perfect sense when we think about reciprocity, for example, in human interactions. So I just thought that I like Kathleen's comment. That was very perceptive.
Yeah, and I'll refer back to our previous session on cultural attraction because I think that provides some theoretical assistance on kind of resolving these more murky issues, and in particular that matrix that broke these kinds of factors of attraction. So like, what are the factors that are leading to the creation of the similar ideas, beliefs, artifacts? And they broke it up into psychological and ecological, and they also broke it up into global and local. So there's sort of global or universal kind of factors, and there's much more contextual, localized ones, and they're both in terms of our psychology and the ecology around us. And so some of the work they've done to separate and to track the kind of actual evolution of cultural content and the ways in which there is often convergence, and I think they do a good job of accounting for transmission and things like that, or at least a starting place. So we have a session on that a couple sessions ago. So I want to hear from Lucas. I haven't heard yet.
So I always loved coming to these meetings because there's so many different ideas. Hank, first, is it Carl Jung you were thinking about, perhaps, when you're thinking about the sphere of sort of sameness, this goal of creating vast differences? I'm not certain about that one. But I was
did you say Foucault?
Carl Jung, is that possible?
No, it's the French guy. No, for sure.
Oh, okay.
Thanks. But
Sure.
He got into it too. Yeah. Thanks.
I'm a social psychologist, and I can't help but think about both Kathleen Walsh's and Kathleen Hart's sort of comments and how to sort of bridge and apply sort of convergent evolution to stories and to culture. I mean, because I think back to John Dewey and George Herbert Mead, when when we think, we're forming a plan, and we're always forming a plan in language. So we're always thinking about some kind of context or content in the world, right? That we can share, that we can interact in terms of, and that at the micro level, sort of culture arises out of a collective survival strategy that comes from sort of thinking about planning, right? Planning together, working together to form a plan. And so if we live in similar circumstances, environmental circumstances, it would make sense. And of course, we're wired similarly, right? Neurobiologically, it would make sense that we could apply convergent evolution to literature and to storytelling and to myths, insofar as they arise in similar sort of circumstances. So I don't know if that's a fully formed thought, but that's kind of something that's come to mind here.
Thanks, Lucas. That's really insightful. I'm just going to keep jumping to folks we haven't heard from yet when they pop up. So, Matt.
Hey everyone. So this is my first time coming. This has been really interesting. So I just wanted to kind of talk about my perspectives coming into this. So I'm a genome biologist, and I'm particularly studying nervous system evolution. And so I have a lot of thoughts that are very biologically centered, especially on convergence. But a major kind of emerging theme in evolutionary biology, particularly in the age of genomics, is this idea of, like, we're talking a lot today about like conditions that are pressuring the emergence of convergence. But I think in our work, we're thinking a lot more now about the inherent architecture that responds to those conditions. And so instead of just having the conditions happening, you have an inherent architecture that is going to respond a similar way in many different situations. And so there's genetic architecture, lots of examples of genetic architecture where this happens, where you have the same underlying genetics that might be invisible if you're just looking at traits and you're just looking at phenotypes. But there's a lot of genetic changes that are happening underneath all of that. And there are examples of like fragile sites in the genome that are particularly likely to mutate under certain conditions. And so you'll see the same sites in the genome mutating under different conditions, totally independently, and those will give rise to the same traits. And so something I'm thinking about a lot with regard to culture is perhaps there is kind of a mimetic architecture, that there might be kind of the way that all of these memes are interacting with each other. There might be some underlying way in which they're related that would predispose them to give rise to these new ideas independently. So that's what I've been thinking about in my kind of free time and my professional time. So that's just my 2 cents there.
It's a really helpful kind of more specific, I think, portrayal of what we're trying to get at around sort of structuralist and, kind of conditional dynamics. And that's really fascinating to think that, there is this kind of modularity with respect to the kinds of outcomes. So despite the various different conditions, the sort of same kind of dynamic occurs using those fragile sides of the architecture, but can result in different traits as necessary to those conditions, or the same traits even despite different conditions. So it really, I think, highlights the profound the profoundness of the architecture and kind of how these adaptive processes at the genetic level really are set up to respond to all this variation. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, certainly the study of memes as sort of the analog is not nearly as clear, and would certainly need to be linked closely to cognition into these neurological processes to get that clarity. But we could imagine that there are sort of, I mean, take a given idea, right? Like, I think the whole point around cultural attractors is that there's some sort of superficial or kind of localized variation, and then yet there's like this core nugget that retains itself, that kind of keeps popping up again and again. So more work needs to be done, I think, to try to understand those processes. Maybe it operates completely differently since it's a separate system, but thank you for sharing that, Matt. That's really helpful and informative. Diane and Or did anyone have a response to what Matt said? Kathleen, Rob, or Diane, or new thoughts?
Well, thanks to Matt, because I thought that was enlightening. I put my hand up when Hank asked the question about what I take from the chat to be Foucault, because I couldn't remember
No, it's
either.
not him. I couldn't get through. Sorry.
Oh, well, I'm not an expert on psychoanalysis by any means, but it seems to me that Freud himself said something about the narcissism of small differences, so that individuals and groups that are quite similar to one another may exaggerate their not really very existent differences in order to distinguish themselves. So that may be what you have in mind, actually. So it's Freud himself in that case.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
But actually, I wanted to say something about Steve's remark, but is he gone now?
Steve had to leave early, yeah.
Well, I'll say it anyway, because he was bringing up the similarity of moral maxims or religious ethics and so on and so forth. And perhaps one day it would be nice for this group to talk about Oliver Curry's work on, as he calls it, morality as cooperation. He's an anthropologist, and he and his colleagues have done a survey of a large number of societies that have enough documentation to be coded for this, and finds that essentially all of these societies, people in all these societies, approve of certain ways of behaving as being moral, essentially. And he breaks them down into what he says are behaviors that promote cooperation or that prevent lack of cooperation. And there are 7 of them. Maybe we'd like to talk about them sometime. But the reason I brought it up here is because the most basic condition for human life actually is the group living socially. And living socially requires cooperation. So it shouldn't be surprising that people come to a fair amount of consensus, given our similar mental nervous system architecture and given our similar requirements for cooperation. It shouldn't be all that surprising that we come up with more or less similar rules about what will help us cooperate or prevent the disruption of non-cooperators. Okay.
Thanks, Diane. Rob?
Well, I don't know that this is going fast. What I was thinking about in terms of cultural evolution is a valiant book by somebody at Harvard named Witzel about mythologies of the world. And in very quick form, he deduces that there were 2 migrations out of Africa. One of them ended up in Southeast Asia, in Australia. And that was one body of mythology. And there was a second migration out, and that he called that Gondwana mythological strain. And then there was the Laurentian, which is the Eurasian and the rest of the world. And they're quite different. Australian mythology, Aboriginal mythology, doesn't have a primordial beginning of anything. People just emerged. And, before that it was dreamtime, and it got a lot of different things. And there's no flood in that one. But the Laurentian mythology is, there's always a cosmic egg or a chaotic watery world that's divided, and out of that emerges the land. And there's a whole genealogy of gods that come up and create people, and they fight with each other, and the gods want to get rid of them because they're too noisy. And that happens a few times. And so the mythologies are quite different. And I'm sort of thinking of, Neanderthal and modern human as two progenitor species to our current genome. And those mythologies operate as a kind of origin, earliest common ancestor to the way our ethics and our stories about each other emerged. So that was my thought.
Thank you, Rob. Kathleen? Oh,
What I was thinking about doesn't really, can you hear me?
yep.
It doesn't really follow from Rob's comment, which was a very interesting comment, but a while back, a phrase that I focused on a lot in college, long time ago, ontogeny replicates phylogeny. I was sort of a developmentalist thinker very early on. And, there is underlying development, and this is something that Diane just mentioned, in our nervous system in terms of the primitive brain, then moving into the emotional brain, the limbic system. And as mammals evolved, they had emotions that informed them about different aspects of the environment, and then the neocortex and the, prefrontal cortex, which is enlarged and links this gray matter to our emotional system. That developmental arc defines an evolution of awareness of the self in relationship to others. And that is replicated on the cultural level. So it's not surprising that these ideas about moral behavior have emerged from different sectors at different times, or at the same time even. The great religions sort of all contained a version of the golden rule. Kathleen, are you correcting me, Kathleen? Recapitulates, did I not say the proper word?
Well, yeah, as the daughter of a biologist, I remember looking at my mother's bookshelf as a teenager and saying, somebody should make a t-shirt out of that. And my mother liked the idea and had a t-shirt made called Ontogeny Recapitulates Phylogeny. And a year later, I was on the other side of the globe and saw somebody wearing the same t-shirt. So.
That's another story about how ideas are shared, or cultural influences seem to happen beyond space and time.
Well, I never knew if the idea spread or if it grew up separately.
We also have those t-shirts at the research place we work at, so.
Now, does this phrase comes from a book, or is this just?
Yeah, she's a biologist. She had a book in her shelf in huge letters, Ontogeny Recapitulates Phylogeny. I saw it almost every day of my existence. And one day I said they should make a t-shirt out of it.
I read that it's not true. But...
Now I wonder if the book came first. Still, that's a project we could take to find the origins of this phrase. Kathleen, I wanted to highlight your mention of ontogeny or development, the developmental stage of our life when we become an adult. I think it is really important and probably a really fruitful area to intersect some of the things that Matt was discussing. This is a stage at which our neural and genetic architecture is closest to the surface, so to speak. And one would, there's something really profound about the fact that, not even just the kind of normal observation of the expectation of cultural change coming from the next generation, which is sort of in itself an admission that each generation occupies like a kind of collective position, even if it's just in the history of time, and that is actually going to restructure or kind of re-emphasize certain aspects of their environment, whether you're growing up in the Great Depression or in the post-war era or now, or those are some of the best examples of kind of generational impacts, or at least populations of generations, where our shared experiences can create profound changes that will affect us for our whole lives. And then there are many unsurprising at that level patterns that emerge from that population as a result. So I think that whole idea and really focusing closely on that developmental stage is key, because I think there's something different, especially when we've been talking about domestication as a prolongment of development, to convergence of adults, for example. It's different right now. A lot of that structure at the deeper level has been kind of already established and is less movable to a certain extent, less flexible. Kathleen Hart.
I'm not sure it's totally in line with what you were saying, but what you said reminded me of this, which is that, okay, it's Nancy Easterlin's work on the Emperor's New Clothes, but even the same story in a culture over time will change. And so the version we're familiar with, Hans Christian Andersen, seems to have emerged at a time when monarchy was really being questioned. And so the child who points out that the king is naked is very different from earlier folk versions and marks a certain time in history. And you could even look at Christian Andersen's background as a sort of proletarian writer. That's not exactly what I was going to say, but I can't remember. So I'll just.
Okay, we'll come back to it if you remember. Well, I wonder how many times in that story it's always a child who's pointing it out, right? Matt,
or a woman or a fool.
right.
No, those are the three main ones: a child, a woman, or a fool.
Somebody
Child,
on the
woman, or
outskirts
fool.
of some way of the dominant society, right? It has to be. Matt, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I think related. I think this idea of like, as we go through developments and when we're young and we're forming all of these neural architectures and we're particularly open to new ideas and open to change. And then as we get older, we tend to kind of close down these different avenues. And I think that does reflect, the kind of plasticity of neural architecture closing down as we get older. But there are lots of really interesting studies going on recently, especially with psychedelics. I'm sure many of you know. There's this idea in neuroscience of critical periods where they're in development. They're like absolutely necessary for the wiring of the nervous system to happen the right way, to give you sight or to give you proper motor control or to give you learning and memory abilities. And with psychedelics, we're thinking actually that it's reopening these critical periods, and that maybe if we are normally refractory to these ideas as we get older, and there are of course examples with like depression or trauma, and that as you can reopen some of these critical periods and kind of the architecture can become more flexible again, maybe you're open to these new ideas, and that maybe the kind of society of different ideas, can now spread and interact. You can interact with them differently. So that's something I think about too.
That's great. Thank you for that addition. So we're coming at the end here. So this is last licks. If anyone wants to leave us pondering a final reflection or idea, we'll pass to Hank.
No pondering, but my chat's not working. But thank you, Diane. But the article by a guy named Carl Figlio from England, it's called The Dread of Sameness, Social Hatred and Freud's Narcissism of Minor Differences. So it is there for me. I couldn't write it in because my chat's not working. So it's at essexuniversity.ac.uk. But so I'm going to study it. But thank you. No, that's Freud's notion, not mine. Yeah.
I see that.
Can we do this again? This topic? I mean, it's just opened up so much wisdom here that people carry with them. I'd like to converge on it more.
Yeah. Well, Rob's has thrown out the idea of neuroplasticity as a topic, and I think that's a nice jumping off point here in terms of what we've been talking about. And I think that might be an important area to better inform our ideas around shared conditions and architecture and these kinds of the processes that actually occur. So
Yeah.
that's great, and I'll definitely make a note of that for our next time. So if you, just as we're wrapping up, if anyone has any words, I'll give a chance here, raise your hand, but otherwise I'll refer you to the chat. You can kind of take your last chance to vote if you haven't already. And if you're joining us today and not on the email list, there, I've shared that link as well. So you can keep look for future sessions. And looking at the votes we have now, accounting for our known voter fraud, still winning by one vote is Darwinian medicine and psychiatry. So that was suggested by Steve. So we'll definitely ask for his input leading into that. And thank you all for coming. This has been really fascinating, and hope to see you all next time. So we are aiming for the first or second Thursday of each month, and we'll let you know the date as soon as possible. All righty. See you, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.